I initially restricted my area to what I call southern Maine. The FIA units of the Capital Region, which is Kennebec, Knox, Lincoln, Waldo, the Casco Bay unit, which is Androscoggin, Cumberland, Saginaw, and York, and then the Western Region, which is Franklin and Oxford. To me, that's where the white pine forest type is. Those three areas are about 4 million acres of timberland. So it's 25% of the state. I then took what FIA calls the white, red, jack pine major forest type group. It has a bunch of other junk in it: jack pine, red pine, hemlock. So it's this mishmash of stuff, and I didn't want to look at the other stuff. I wanted to focus on white pine. So I took two of the forest types, eastern white pine, which has under 400,000 acres. Those 400,000 acres are 60% of the acres statewide. Looked at eastern white pine, eastern hemlock, only 80,000 acres. But again, it's the bulk of the state acres are in that forest type in southern Maine. And then the last one is sort of this oddball. It's called eastern white pine, northern red oak, white ash. But it's grouped in another group called oak pine, but it has more pine in it than it has oak. So I included this one also with 270,000 acres. Those acres represent 77% of that forest type is in southern Maine. So these three types are very much southern Maine types. There's 1 million acres here. So these three types represent 25% of the southern Maine timberland. So it is a big piece. If we look across time and look at what's called stand size class, we see a disturbing trend. The green is large diameter stand size class, or saw timber stand size class. We go from 48% to 88%. Conversely, the small diameter stand size class, your seedling, your sapling, goes from just 30% to maybe 5% over the same period. Where are we regenerating white pine if everything is in a large diameter stand size class? In addition to looking at marchable trees, we can now look at seedlings per acre. So this is what happens across a very short time frame of 04 to 16. This is the trend in these forest types of white pine seedlings. So we are getting seedlings on the landscape. Those seedlings aren't becoming saplings. This is the 2-inch class from 1.0 to 2.9. This is the 4-inch class from 3.0 to 4.9. So those seedlings, to a large degree, aren't coming through and becoming saplings. And these 2-inch saplings, even to a worse degree, are not growing and becoming 4-inch saplings. So we're losing this transition of even what we have, it ain't making it through. When we go to marchable trees, we see the same problem. Those 4-inch saplings aren't making it through to pole timber. Pole timber is a declining resource, 5 to 9-inch trees. Where are these trees going? Over the period, they became small saw timber. They grew up, got bigger, are more valuable. In this category, small saw timber, we're pretty much cutting and growing. We're keeping that trees in that stand size, those diameter ranges, pretty equal across this 20-year period. Large saw timber, we're putting them on the landscape. They're growing and becoming more prevalent. Trees 15 inches and larger. We have a couple bumps. We go from 16 to 18 to 19 trees per acre on average are 15 inches and larger. So that's sort of some of the dynamics of trees. Now let's go to volume. This is growing stock volume, so this is quality trees. What I'm displaying is cords per acre by 3 different DBH ranges. The blue is pole timber, the orange is small saw, and then the grayish one is large saw timber. From 95, we actually had a decline up until 2010. We bounced back to a total volume the same. Our large saw timber dropped from 95, but since then it's been fairly consistent. Small saw timber has gained a little bit across time, whereas pole timber has actually declined a little bit. So we're keeping the same stocking out there. It's just a little shifting between different DBH ranges. So now if we look at all of the white pine in that southern Maine area, here's what we see across time. A lot of volume. It peaked back here seemingly in 2013 based on the data years I have. So we have about 18 million cords of white pine in those southern Maine counties. That's about half of the total volume of white pine in the state. So there's still a lot of white pine in southern Maine. So now I'm going to switch and look at statewide. So to just sort of back up to summarize, yes, we're losing the white pine forest type. It's going away. We aren't clear cutting, we aren't burning, we no longer have abandoned fields that are growing back to white pine. So the pure pine forest type is leaving our landscape. And if we want to keep that as a part of the landscape, we need to do some targeted management to keep that forest type in southern Maine. That's the issue with the forest type. If we now switch to a broader focus and look at white pine statewide, what's the current situation? Well, white pine is a tree that shows up in a lot of different forest types. And in northern and eastern Maine, in my experience over the 70s and the 80s, when I was working for Great Northern Paper Company and clear cutting hundreds of acres a day, we went by a lot of the pine from 5 to 10 inches. There was no market for it. We left it standing on the landscape. Champion International down in Hancock County, Georgia Pacific over in Washington County, same thing. The pine stayed there. Well, over 40 years, that pine has gotten bigger and has stayed on the landscape. This is my top 10. So in terms of pulpwood, red maple's #1 in terms of pulpwood quality, volume statewide. White pine's #2. Since 2006, white pine pulpwood volume and better has increased 15%. Since 2011, it's increased 9%. So if we then switch to saw timber, white pine is the #1 species for saw timber in the state of Maine. It is beating the pants off of red spruce by 1 billion board feet. Why? Because white pine has increased 21% in the last 10 years. Has increased 6% in the last 5 years. Whereas red spruce actually is down a percentage point since 2006, but is starting to recover. It's up 4% in the last 5 years. So we see these dynamics of different species and so on. But white pine is a major part of the statewide landscape and resource. Here's the same graph statewide by pole timber, small saw timber, large saw timber. Again, small saw timber, not much of a change. I mean, in pole timber, not much of a change across time. Small saw timber, yep, we've had some increases going from 6, 7 to around 10 million cores. The biggest change again statewide is this large saw timber increase in volume from 7 million to 24. So we even when we look across the state, we have a lot of large white pine out there, and it's quality pine. So I was saying in southern Maine, there's a lot of reasons why pine isn't increasing. And if we look at some of the other FIA units, we see between 95 and 2016, Washington County doubled its white pine saw timber volume. Penobscot County doubled its white pine saw timber volume. Hancock County doubled. Piscataquis County doubled. So these are large counties, and they've doubled their white pine saw timber volume. So there is pine out there. It's not in the traditional areas that the white pine forest type has been. Here's Casco Bay, just a little bit of a bump. Capital Region had about a 36% increase. The Western Region, Franklin, Oxford County, is actually down 5% over this 20-year period. So we can grow pine, we can grow quality pine. Do we also cut pine? The answer is yes. So looking at saw timber and pulpwood, so here's saw timber from the Maine Forest Service Wood Processor Report. This is what we publish on an annual basis based on information given to us by the various primary processing facilities. So the gray is what stays in state for processing. The orange is an export that goes somewhere out of state for processing. And so combined, the two areas represent the saw timber harvest. So we see pretty consistent volumes or shares between in-state and out-of-state. We see from about 2008 that our in-state processing has actually increased. So mills have put on new efficiencies. The Irving sawmill is in this period of coming online. This big bump in exports is an aberration, and none of us can figure it out, but somebody in York County in 2012 shipped 1 million board feet from York County to New Hampshire for processing. So it was a big bump, but then it went away. We do see a decline in our harvest over the last couple of years for saw timber. Minor decline compared to this decline in pulpwood over the last 4 years from 2012. We don't, because the pine pulpwood has little value, it's a hard time selling it out of state. So most of what we have is all produced in state. And we see the loss of those markets over this last 4-year period. Is there potential for more manufacturing of white pine? Yes. And depending on what you want to make out of it, so this is just total harvest. So back in 1959, the FIA report said we were overcutting white pine. Only time that any of those inventory reports said that. So we show surplus back here, we just don't know what it is. Starting in 2006, we can start to break out where the surplus is. The brown is pole timber, the blue is small saw timber, and then the green is large saw timber. So this is surplus, meaning excess net growth to removals in the same period. In 2016, there's pretty much an equal opportunity of about 250,000 cords in either of those three DBH ranges. So, I mean, yeah, we can cut more pulpwood. We can also cut more small saw timber, and we can cut more large saw timber. So there are opportunities out there still existing for white pine that either existing mills or new manufacturing facility can take advantage of. So that's my quick assessment of white pine. It all started with a request for some help, and I expanded on the request because I thought it was important to also look at statewide trends rather than a more focused area.